Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about a rebuttal that Lyle McDonald, who himself also has a degree and background and is a writer about exercise science, kind of his problem with a recent study that Dr. Brad Schoenfeld did about volume. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing. We're going to scale up my crafting a little bit and let's talk about this. And guys, this is going to be one of the interesting things. This is something a lot of people and coaches point out there, that a lot of researchers, even good researchers in the field of exercise science, that they don't always agree that their findings really correlate with what they find with working with people around the world. In other words, they study a lot of things that don't really seem to work the way that the study claims that it does when you actually put it into the real world. And oftentimes they'll have conclusions they draw from their statistics and everything, that it's just their interpretation of the statistics and someone else can have a very different interpretation of it. And Brad's study is definitely one of those. And Lyle McDonald, again, is very well known for kind of debunking different research that he disagrees with, that he feels has a lot of bias in it. He's known for doing that over the years. He's somewhat famous for it. And he's actually somewhat debunked problems and even studies that I've referenced to you guys over the years. Everything from Lane Norton stuff to, what's his name? The glute guy. Brain says my brain. I've quoted several of his studies. You guys know what I'm Brett Contreras. So, what he had a problem with, and I'll probably link this down in the description below, not the description, but in the comments, I'll link the thing so you guys can look at it yourself if you're actually curious. But more or less, he had a problem with it because looking at the different groups of volume, there was a problem. And this is what's noted, that he noted that the highest volume group saw the highest hypertrophy, but all groups, because they used similar weights on the bar, saw similar gains in strength. Right? They saw similar gains in strength. Well, that already kind of is a problem, isn't it? Because you look at that work that Schoenfeld did with Greg Nuckols, with Brett Contreras. They did a massive study a while back, and they found that total muscle mass in the body was the largest factor once it was equated for height to someone's max squat, right? That's what they found. And they found it was pretty conclusive, as in they could actually take, once they look at the statistics, they could look at basically a scan of a person, look at their height, look at the amount of muscle on their body, their lean mass, and they could plug into a calculator and hit their 1 rep max squat within 10% on a guess. In other words, if you had an X amount of muscle at X amount of height through your whole body, they could plug it in and estimate you to have a 450 squat, and odds are, if you went and tested your max squat, you would be within 10% or less of their estimate every single time. In other words, they found that the correlation between muscle mass, as long as you, again, have a formula you plug in for height, muscle mass through the entire body, amount of average muscle mass through your body, not just what was in your legs, but the difference between legs and upper body could have been why there's up to a 10% variation. But that actually gave a very, very accurate estimate of what you could squat for a 1 rep max to depth, like to at least parallel. And they studied this. They had multiple different researchers working on it independently and compiled the data together, and it all actually came to the same conclusions. So that was pretty interesting. So again, this idea, he's right here, well, that more volume will build more size, but not more strength. Well, what Lyle's kind of arguing is that no, it won't. No, it won't. In fact, if the volume doesn't increase strength more, it probably won't really increase hypertrophy significantly more, because the two can't be fully separated. And what he pointed out is that no, the amount of tension will oftentimes be a factor in how much total muscle you gain. In other words, it takes a certain amount of muscle to lift a certain amount of weight on a big movement. At the end of the day, tension matters. And that's the problem with some of these studies on volume, is that some of the researchers are trying to go away from that and say that, well, volume is more important than tension. And other people are saying, no, you can't separate the two like that. The amount of mechanical tension involved and the amount of weight lifted absolutely matters, and you can't take away from that. It's been observed for decades and decades in the strength and conditioning world and coaches observing athletes. Yeah, no, the tension absolutely matters. Absolutely matters. And what he pointed out is that there's problems with the statistics because it's the fact that he's saying that he just seems a weird coincidence that two of these studies in a row wanting to find this conclusion just happened to when they took randomly selected people. The group that had the highest volume training had the lowest amount of muscle mass, had people randomly selected. And his implication there is that it might not be random, which would be, again, create some bias in the study. Now, what people need to understand, we talk about bias in studies. When researchers are setting up variables, just because there's bias and something seems to be biased doesn't mean that they consciously did it. People need to understand that researchers oftentimes get so married to a hypothesis that when they're setting up their tests, their randomness might not be as random if they have a say in it, and it might not be something they're doing consciously. It could be a minor thing that they do subconsciously, and that's also worth noting. So just because bias is there that looks like bias when you can see it, and something that appears it's supposed to be random doesn't appear to be random, that doesn't mean that it was an intentional thing that they did. All right, that could be a subconscious thing that someone does because they really want to believe in their hypothesis so bad. And every human is subject to this. All right, we're all humans. People conducting research are human beings, and they have biases and everything. And those biases can impact the way they set up studies. It can impact the way that they look at the conclusions. And it doesn't mean that they've done something wrong, and that's what people need to understand. Biases just can make you look at things a certain way or subconsciously do things that you have no ill intentions in doing. So let's make that clear. So no one's like calling Brad like a bad person, to my knowledge at least in this, or saying, oh, that this is the signs of that you did something wrong, because it's not necessarily the case. And if you understand human nature and the way this works with researchers, people should understand that actually isn't necessarily the case, and it very probably isn't the case. But Brad he sells training books and everything else, and he has a potential financial bias towards the higher, really high volume training with very wide exercise selection so he can sell programs and books. And so you've got to keep that in mind, and that doesn't mean that he's going to intentionally skew research, but it means that he's got a bias towards it. He has an interest there. And he might subconsciously push things in that direction, or try to push studies that will show what he wants to see, because it's in his best interest. And that's normal. That's human nature. It doesn't make someone a bad person. So people need to remember that. That's not saying that, oh, it's terrible. But, Lyle did point out it's sure convenient that happened, because the problem with it is that because it happened, it creates a flaw in the conclusions of the study already. Like, even if it really and truly was completely random, and let's assume that it is. I mean, that's a fair assumption. That can happen. It could have really been randomly selected. It very well could have. And it probably was. The problem is that he points out the people with the least muscle have the most potential for muscle growth no matter what program you use. In other words, it's his contention that had you stuck the people with the lowest amount of muscle mass in one of the other two groups, that group might have shown the largest percentage in muscle gain. Now, do you guys see the problem there? So, because the actual groups themselves did not all start, the average didn't start at the same amount. In other words, every single person used in all three groups wasn't exactly, say, 5'7" with 142 pounds of lean mass, right? Had they all been, we would actually have a good scenario. They had differing amounts of muscle and differing amount of heights and different, we had people who were slightly different. People say, well, that's how it works in the real world. That is how it works in the real world, but you can't do that with science. It can create a problem in the studies because you have a group that already, had you put all of them on the exact same program with the exact same volume, would have produced different results. Because smaller people who have less muscle have more potential for muscle gain over X number of weeks and months. Right? In other words, the bigger you are, the harder it is to gain more muscle. That group already had an advantage. They had an advantage. And what Lyle points out is that it looks like all they did was catch up. The group that had the most potential for growth just did better catching up with everyone else towards reaching the end result. And he pointed out, look, at the end of the study, after whatever amount of weeks or months, everyone pretty well ended up the same. So he's like, one group, the final group, they put in more work. They put in more work and ended up in the same spot as the people who put in less work. That doesn't make sense. And again, that's a flaw in the statistics. And ultimately, he's like, we shouldn't see, if you're gaining more muscle in one group, you definitely shouldn't see a weaker strength at the end. Because we go back to that other data that Brad was a part of, Dr. Brad was definitely a part of, a big part of that data, that showed that total muscle mass relative to height is the primary determining factor in your strength. On the squat, at least. So there's a problem there. There's a problem there. And what Lyle points out is that, and if you go back and look at this data reasonably, there's no reason to think that the medium volume group had any less hypertrophic potential than the higher volume group there. That it's not the same dose-dependent relationship that he's saying. There is a cutoff point to where more volume doesn't equal more muscle growth. In other words, guys, endless amounts of sets doesn't produce guaranteed more muscle growth than fewer amounts. Right there, it doesn't guarantee that. And he pointed out, he thinks, based upon various studies that have been done, that it's probably somewhere for most people, and depending upon the rep range and everything else, it's probably something around 12 to 14 sets per week. In other words, somewhere around that 12 to 14 set per week mark, you're going to see maximum hypertrophy in any given muscle, and it's very unlikely, and without drugs going into the equation, that you're going to see any measurable larger amount of muscle growth beyond that. Now, does that mean that no one should ever exceed that? No, it doesn't mean that. Because if you can recover from it and it doesn't impact your recovery and you don't mind putting in the extra work, there is no negative. However, if the additional volume starts to affect your recovery or starts to become a problem for you with your time management, then, and you're doing work that isn't doing anything for you, well, that's wasteful also. And the way to look at it is, if you determined that if you worked at a job X number of hours per week and you got paid X amount of money per hour, and at a certain point, and maybe it's an ambiguous point to where you don't know the exact cutoff point, you don't know whether your cutoff point is at 30 hours or 40 hours a week, right? But it's somewhere in that range, and they stop paying you after a certain point, you probably realistically may not want to put in more than about 40 hours, since that's guaranteed to be kind of, your top range or estimated. And if you end up working 50 hours or 60 hours or 70 hours, you are doing work for free with no payout. And that's a good way to look at it. You are fatiguing yourself and wasting your own time towards a goal that may not be giving you anything back in return beyond just your fatigue and time. And that's the way to look at it. And so again, having a realistic estimate of where that maximum effective dose is probably a good idea. And it's going to be dynamic. And like he said, it seems to be around the 12 to 14, but for some people it could be lower in certain situations. And some people's genetics and situation, everything else in life, it might be higher. So, it's not going to be a fixed thing, but it's probably somewhere in that ballpark. So in other words, if someone has you doing 20, 25, 30 sets a week for a given muscle group, realistically speaking, no matter what other little data gets kind of thrown around out there about it, looking at it that way, you're probably wasting a lot of time in the gym in regards to stimulating muscle growth. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.